Hey gang, welcome to this week's episode, a couple of scary stories from hikers. I appreciate those of you who submitted stories and always do, and anyone can. Send yours to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Speaking of which, looking for scary boating or water stories, and even though we're a month out, how about some scary stories about crazy ex-partners for Valentine's Day? Working on a special for that. I mentioned the cold weather last week. Well, yeah, today it was 62 and there's no more snow. Tomorrow, back down to 10 and more snow on the way. Whee! It's fun living where I live. At any rate, kick back, relax, and enjoy. Hunted in the Night. Submitted by Jackson Hole 99. In 1996, my girlfriend and I wanted to take off from our summer jobs and walk part of the Appalachian Trail. We had been hiking together since we met in college, and she was a lot like me and didn't care about living on the trail and not always being able to jump in a shower. Some people think that's gross, but really it isn't. We did bathe with biodegradable soap, but only when we got off the trail every 4 or 5 days and hit up a motel and a restaurant before replenishing our supplies. I know, a lot of folks can't handle that, but we had no problem with it. This trip was a 3-week that took us through North Carolina and part of Tennessee. All told, it was about 170 miles that we covered on this leg. We flew down and stayed with some friends for a day, and they drove us out to the trail. The plan was to get close to the Virginia border to a little town, and then we would figure out how to get back home to King of Prussia in Pennsylvania where we lived. We were very free-spirited back then, and we kind of just let life take us where it wanted us to go. On the trail, we met a lot of really great people like everyone always does. We had tents, but sometimes shared shelters with other hikers. The weather was great and we were having a blast, making about 10 miles a day or thereabouts. Heather and I had a solid routine down pat, and we knew exactly when the other person needed to get off the trail for running water and a soft bed. It was on this trip that she asked me to marry her. I remember telling her I was the guy and I was supposed to ask that, and we laughed, but I told her we should do it. Sadly, she passed away 9 years later due to some health issues that sprang up. This story is the most intense thing I've ever been through with anyone, and it will forever be etched in my mind. We were one day out from our destination and thinking about a meal that didn't involve noodles and other freeze-dried stuff. We were going to hit a logging road that the trail crossed about 4 miles away and follow that into a little town that had accommodations, restaurants, stores, motels, and a laundromat. We could have made it that day, but if you're an outdoors person, you know the feeling of wanting to savor that last day out in the woods. That last afternoon, we met 2 young guys on the trail that hiked with us for a bit, and then hung out with us at the shelter we were planning on staying the night at. I didn't think it odd at the time, but looking back on it, I should have seen the red flags right away. They only had light rucksacks and were wearing sneakers. They certainly weren't doing any serious hiking. I also remember one of them making glances at Heather a lot. But she was beautiful, and I can't blame anyone who stared at her. Still, I think I was just tired and ready to get off the trail and not taking everything in. As the lights started to fade and we had got some water from a spring, Heather and I made our supper and were ready to just crash before the last stage of our trip the next morning. I hope I don't sound like a creep, and I'm happily married to my wonderful wife. But that last night on the trail with her in my arms before we fell asleep is the way I'll always remember her. We were both in sleeping bags, but I had my arms out of mine and was just holding her. I woke up sometime in the night by the sounds of someone or something walking through the forest. Definitely not on the trail. I immediately thought it was just a critter, but then felt the urge to take a leak and got up and went out away from the shelter. I had just finished my piss when I looked up behind the shelter, and off in the distance, maybe a quarter of a mile away, I saw 2 lights. Flashlights coming down the gentle slope of the hill. This was not right at all, and I got nervous real quick. People don't bushwhack much on the Appalachian Trail, and they certainly don't do it through the woods at night. I'm just telling you, they don't do it. I quickly went back to the shelter and woke up Heather and told her we needed to get out of there. Something was up. She could tell how nervous I was, and she didn't say a word, and we quickly gathered up our gear, put on our packs, and carried our sleeping bags as I told her we had to hurry. I did leave behind my Whisperlight stove and a bottle of fuel. I do remember that. We hustled away from the shelter and looked back to see the lights getting closer than they were before, and Heather just whispered, "Oh my God, you're right." We crept down the trail in the direction we needed to go and pulled off to properly put our bags in our packs. We heard voices off in the distance, and I swear I could see the lights bobbing up to the shelter. I said we need to get moving right now, even though it was dark. I had a really bad feeling. Before we got going again, I did take out my Beretta and put it in my side pants pocket. A lot of people will tell you it's bad and sometimes illegal to carry a firearm on the trail, but while I was sort of granola, I was also not stupid. It stayed in my pack most of the time, except for at night, but now I wanted it at the ready. The voices from behind were now yelling and calling out things we couldn't understand, but again, I knew it wasn't good. It was also hard navigating the trail in the dark despite there being a full moon. That didn't really filter through the trees too much, though. We kept on, not saying a word, and I knew Heather was as scared as I was, and we just needed to get to that logging road and we could pick up the pace to the main highway and into town. After what I figured was about 3 miles down the trail, we stopped to catch our breath and drink some water. The trail had started to slowly rise, and I was sure we were getting close to the road as my shitty map did show a change in terrain. If you've ever hiked the AT, you know that the maps can be terribly deceiving and sometimes totally fucking useless. Thank God that wasn't the case this time. We got back moving, and suddenly I got a strange feeling and stopped. I put my arm out to stop Heather and peered up the trail. There was a break in the trees, and I could make out the moonlight and clear sky and noticed something strange. There was a shape on the edge of the trail right near that clearing, and suddenly it rose up, and I could see the silhouette of a person standing there. I quietly told my girlfriend to slowly get off the trail to our left, and that we were going into the woods. She did, and I followed her, trying to be as quiet as I could, and we moved about 50 feet into the trees. A few minutes later, we saw the beam of another flashlight coming down the trail from the direction we were going. I think I held my breath for like 3 minutes, that's what it felt like. This figure walked by our hiding spot and down the trail. I told Heather to stay right with me, and we crept back to the trail, and when we got to it, I saw the light disappear around the bend and then vanish into the darkness. I knew for sure we were being hunted. We got back on the trail and double-timed it up the small ridge. It dropped back down, and after about 15 minutes, we did come to that logging road. There was a little creek that ran beside it, and some of it spilled across the road between the mouths of the trail. I started for the other side, and Heather asked what the fuck I was doing, and I told her, "Shut up and just follow me." We walked through the damp parts of the road, leaving boot prints in the direction of the trail, and then we immediately got off of it and followed the edge of the road closely, heading back to the main road. We got about 200 yards down and then popped back out onto the road. Off in the distance, we heard the yelling again, and I stopped and looked back down the road. We could see 3 little lights come out onto it and stop right where we had walked in the mud. There was more yelling, and the lights went across and back up into the trail, and we didn't hesitate to turn and keep moving really fast. It took another half hour to get to the main road, and then it was about 2 more miles into town. We kept going, and at one time a truck came by us, and for one terrifying minute, I thought for sure it was whoever was out there looking for us. It wasn't, thank God again, and it just drove on. We got into town, and there was an AmeriCorps open, and we got a room. It was now about 4 in the morning, and I realized I was still shaking. Heather was upset too. I collapsed on the bed while she showered, and then I did too, and we got under the sheets and talked about what had happened before finally falling asleep. The next day we had to do laundry, and I could not stop looking over my shoulder and eyeing up everyone who came into the laundromat. I saw a sign on a bulletin board for a guy who gave people rides for reasonable prices, and I went to a payphone and asked him how much it would be to take us to Damascus, Virginia. He said $50, and I told him to pick us up at the hotel the next morning, and after some barbecue and sleep, we were on our way to get a rental car to drive home. Can I say for certain what those people were up to? No, but it was odd that they came to our shelter in the middle of the night, and that there was someone else on the trail walking around that late. I'm convinced that they had bad intentions for us, and that we were lucky to get out of there when we did. My second wife and I still hike, but they're just day trips with our kids. I'm sure I'll get back out there, but after over 20 years, that night has stayed with me, and deep down I think I want that to be my last long trip and to let it rest with Heather. I think that's only fitting. I Hope It Was an Animal by WPNW. This happened while I was backpacking in the Goat Rocks Wilderness in Washington State. My friend and I were trying to get up into a certain basin above the tree line, and we got a really late start thanks to road construction. We were really hoofing it up the trail, trying to make camp before dark. My friend hikes way faster than I do, so he got way out ahead of me, and by the time I got to where our detour from the main trail took to go up to the informal boot path that would take us up to the basin, he was nowhere to be seen. So, there being no campsites near where I stopped, I backtracked for about 3/4 of a mile to a lake where there were established campsites right along the trail. After maybe an hour, my friend showed up, and it was well after dark. We settled in not really knowing our surroundings. It was a fairly large open area though, so it was likely a horse camp, because the trail is popular with horse packers, but we encountered none. We just set up our tents and ate, then went to bed. Neither of us usually sleep well when backpacking, but for whatever reason, my friend was out cold, and I was sort of awake at best for quite a while, just listening to the sounds of nature, and trying not to psych myself out about the possible demons and monsters, man-eating beasts lurking in the woods every time I heard a twig snap or a pine cone fall from a tree. So maybe 3 or 4 hours after I went to bed, and this would have been around 1 a.m., I started hearing a very distinct sound of heavy footsteps around my camp area. I didn't really think to analyze the patterns the footsteps made at the time, but I remember it sounding distinctly bipedal. You can usually pick out a deer or a mountain goat because they don't plant their feet in pairs. Other than these occasional footsteps, it was basically dead silent. No crickets or rustling of bushes or anything. That silence was instantly shattered by the most terrifying sound I have ever heard in my life. It was basically the same intensity as a whistle on a steam train, but much, much deeper and more demonic. Almost like a cross between a cow mooing and a lion's roar, but loud enough that it echoed off the mountains on the opposite side of the valley. Immediately after this noise, this creature went hauling ass off into the woods, crashing through the bushes. The forest I could see when I set up camp was basically covered in high huckleberry shrubs. But it remained running around in earshot for at least 2 minutes, running back and forth, sometimes getting distinctly closer, sometimes going farther away. All this time it sounded like it was a creature with 2 legs running around, and this whole time my heart was doing about 200 beats per minute. I was sure I was going to be eaten by a chupacabra or something. After a couple of minutes, the footsteps faded, and it fell silent again, and I never heard anything else. I probably lay awake for at least another hour before I finally fell asleep, and my friend didn't hear a damn thing all night. In the morning when I woke up, I looked around, and there was a wide open area that led down to a small beach at the nearby lake. I went over to see if there was any evidence of what the noise was. Turns out there were fresh elk prints in the mud near the lake, and maybe 20 to 30 feet away was a large print of either a cougar or a bear. I couldn't tell which. So, likely, something was stalking one of the elk that wandered near my camp and spooked it in the middle of the night and caused it to spaz the fuck out. I'll never know, but at least that's what I hope it was. Trouble in the Maze, submitted by Sir Hikes-A-Lot. I've been an avid hiker since I was a little kid, and my parents took me camping and hiking all the time. I look back and think about all the great trips we went on and how even almost every night after dinner we went on walks or hikes to different places around town. I started going on solo jaunts when I was only 16 and did my first overnight hike that year for my birthday. It was only 25 miles, but it was my first taste of being on my own, all alone in the woods. Spark turned into a flame, and to this day, 17 years later, I'm still at it. I've hiked the AT, the PCT, and all over Europe. I've done things solo and with groups, and I can't tell you how amazing it is if you've never tried it. This doesn't mean I haven't had mishaps out there, and this story is about a lesson I learned in what normally would have been a relatively easy hike in decent weather. I was hiking in Utah at a place called the Maze when I was 24 years old. It's in Canyonlands National Park, and it's a pretty fun and extreme place to explore. I was supposed to go with a friend, TA, but he backed out at the last minute. I had already taken time off at work and still wanted to go, so I said, screw it, I'm going for it. I got to the Maze Overlook campground late on a Thursday night, and if anyone ever goes or has gone, you know and will find out the drive out there is crazy. I parked and set up my tent, and I was planning on exploring the maze around Chocolate Drops Trail, hiking to the Wall campground the next day, relax there with a nice bourbon I brought along, and then head back north on Saturday. It's about a 12-mile hike and can be pretty technical at spots, and I'd never been there before, but figured if I wasn't stupid, it would be another killer trip. The next morning I was up early, made breakfast and got my gear together, and made my way down the Maze Overlook Trail, which was a little more scrambly than I'd heard about or researched. But it was worth it to get down into the canyon. It was just 7 miles or so to the Wall, and the weather was great. I poked in and around the maze, and let me tell you, there are a lot of dead ends in those nooks and crannies. I only saw one other hiker heading back to the Overlook, and we stopped and talked for about half an hour. He was coming back from Teapot Rock and had stopped at the Wall. I asked if he'd seen anyone else, and he said the trail would be all mine as far as he knew. I kept on rambling, and the walls of the maze started to fall away, and the hike was clear to the Wall. Now, the Wall is a giant mesa standing on its own, and it's really impressive. I found a decent spot at the designated camp area, and all was well. I put up my tent next to a couple of big flat rocks, set up a kitchen area for my stove, and heated up some water for my cup of noodle soup. I had a couple of pieces of beef jerky, and just sat looking at the beautiful terrain out west. It was about 4 in the afternoon, and I ate and poured a bourbon and relished in the fact that I was in one of those big sky days where everything just went so awesome. I wrote some notes in a little hiking book I keep with me, and had another bourbon. As the sun began to set, I cleaned up, drank a bunch of water, and secured my pack a little ways away from my tent. This was late August, and I heard that sometimes the coyotes and even bears pop out this way. I crawled into my tent and drifted off. And the next morning I woke up to the sun poking over the ridges, but it was a little colder, but not terribly noticeable. I did my morning breakfast thing and got ready to head back. As I moved along, I started to notice it was getting a little cloudy, and then I turned to look back to the west. Oh, shit. The skies were getting dark, and it looked like rain. I started moving faster, knowing that I wasn't going to get ahead of the storm that was most certainly coming. This was monsoon season, and all I could think about was hoping it would move south of where I was going. By now I was in the maze pretty well, but could hear the rumbling of thunder, and then the rain came. It was coming down in buckets. I pushed on, and the thunder got louder, and then there was hail. I kept pushing on, hoping it would just blow right over, but it didn't. It kept pouring. The water was cascading down the steep walls, and then simply turned into a stream on the canyon floor. It seemed like forever, but probably only lasted 15 minutes, but when you're out in it and the water is just rushing by you and down from above, all you can do is focus ahead and not on the fact that one wrong step could mean your death. I mean, the rocks are rocks, but they can be really smooth, and with 8 or 9 inches of water rushing along, you can slip and fall. Which is exactly what happened to me. My left foot slipped and went back into a crevice, and a bolt of pain went up my leg, and I nearly buckled my knees forward, but caught myself. For a second or two, I thought, shit, this is it. I'm going to die in a flash flood alone. I looked up ahead and saw a portion of the canyon open up, and there was a place to get above the water. I got my foot out, and the adrenaline was pounding through me as I fought to get to the safe spot less than 100 yards away. The rain let up, but the rushing water didn't, and actually increased as all the runoff of the trail ahead was flowing by me. I finally reached a stop away from the flash flood and took off my pack and sat down breathing heavily. I checked my left ankle, and it was a little sore, but it wasn't sprained or broken. I just sat there watching the water splash and pound by for quite a while before it started to subside. The sun started to come back out, and I just waited another hour or so before I took a chance of finishing the hike and facing that scrambly bit back that I had to take to get to my truck. It was slippery and a little sloppy, but I finally made it up and out and staggered to my truck. I opened it, threw my pack in the back, but not before I grabbed the bourbon for one last belt to calm me down. I sat in my truck just to relax and be happy that I was okay. I'd have plenty of time to mull things over. The drive in and out there is a long one, and I changed my clothes just as another truck pulled up. 2 guys got out and one yelled over, "You hiked through that?" I nodded, and they shook their head and just said, "Damn, man." I smiled, got back in my truck, and started it up to make the drive back to my hometown of Grand Junction. I'm very lucky to still be here. It hits me now even more after some folks recently hiking in Zion Canyon got caught in a flood and didn't make it. That was certainly one of the scariest times of my life. It Came from the Fog by John R. There are things that happen in everyday life that we are unable to explain. Images, sounds, and movements that frighten our psyche and question if what we witness is actually happening or was just part of our wild imagination. One of these events happened to me last month. I live in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. I like to take frequent hikes through the trails close by to my apartment, and I've always had this fascination with nature. It's just always been a personal hobby of mine. I love taking in landscapes of forests and absorbing the peaceful environment all around me. Usually I take walks with friends who share my passion, but oftentimes I feel like they slow me down. A lot of my buddies aren't in the best physical shape, so they often complain and move kind of slowly. On this particular day, I got home from work around 5 and decided to take a hike by myself. I set off the trail a little later, and it was cool outside, so I decided to jog the hike, which was just about 4 miles in length. I passed by a few other people on the trail, but not too many. There didn't seem to be a lot of people hiking this day. As I neared the end of the first pass, it started to get a little darker out, and I stopped seeing anybody on the trail. I got the eerie sense that I was being followed by something, and I picked up my pace. After the halfway point, dusk was on me, and out of nowhere it started to get really foggy. The air around me started to turn into a dark gray haze, and at first it was just a thin layer, but as I continued, it started to get so bad that I couldn't see 6 feet in front of me. My heart rate started jacking up with the feeling of something still following me through the fog. I wanted to turn around to convince myself I was just imagining things, but I was too afraid to stop. Sick of feeling paranoid, I finally came to a sudden stop. I turned around, and there through the haze was a woman standing just a few yards away from me. I knew there was no one else on the trail, as I didn't pass anybody after the halfway point. Panicking, I started running as fast as I could back to my car. I looked back again, and the woman was still the same distance away from me, just right down the trail. She just stood there looking right through me. I kept running, hoping to get away from this mysterious figure, and my heart was pounding, sweat was dripping from my forehead, and I was breathing heavy. I felt like I was going to have a panic attack, and then I noticed the fog was suddenly disappearing around me. I looked back again. The mysterious woman had vanished. I kept running quickly to the end of the trail anyway, and I finally reached my car. Ever since that day, I've been too afraid to take hikes alone. I've replayed the events in my head, trying to convince myself I'm not crazy. I don't know what the mysterious figure in the fog was, but I know it was there, and I feel it in my bones that I barely escaped with my life that day. Good Thing We Found Them by Gadella08. My friends and I found a 22-year-old girl face down in the mud, both legs broken with compound fractures. She had no cell phone, no water, no food, and nothing to keep her warm. Even worse, her hiking friend was dead. A little backstory. My 2 friends and I were hiking in a pretty popular spot in our area. It's a 150-foot waterfall that takes about 45 minutes of uphill hiking to get to. We decided to go bouldering around the bottom of the waterfall, and there are various little pools and boulders where the water runs off from the waterfall. This bouldering trail is not on the main trail, and not many hikers ever veer off the main trail. When we found this woman, obviously we called 911 and gave her any supplies we had. Turns out she was hiking with her friend the night before, when they both fell off of the waterfall. Her friend must have gone to get help, but unfortunately died less than 100 yards from where we found this girl. So no one knew she was hurt, or that she was even out there. It's a miracle she was still alive, and mind-blowing to think that what she had gone through when we found her 20 hours later. As soon as we found her, we tried to assess the situation, and I got as much information as I possibly could. She told us her name, her story, and said she had 2 broken ankles, and we visually inspected the injuries to see if we had to stop any bleeding. We confirmed 2 Joe Theismann-style leg breaks, and we gave her water immediately, and she said that she had finished her food and water the night before. I asked how many were in your party, and when did this happen? Does anything hurt? Are you bleeding? And whatever else Boy Scout questions I could think of. When we called 911, we stressed to the operator that there were serious injuries and we needed that helicopter. People get a lot of sprained ankles and such on these hikes, but nothing was like what I had ever seen out here. We had the Montecito Fire Department on the phone, and they knew the trail, but they didn't know exactly where we were. They asked for someone to meet them at the trailhead just in case the chopper couldn't see the injured girls and the rest of our party from the sky. They launched a chopper from dispatch, and my buddy and his girlfriend stayed on the phone and stayed with the injured girl. I went down to the trailhead and met them at the bottom of Cold Springs Trail. It's about 45 minutes up, so it was about 30 minutes down. And knowing that a girl's life was in danger, I ran like a bat out of hell. Think Last of the Mohicans type shit. I met the fire department at the bottom, and there were 6 guys. We were bringing a stretcher and medical supplies, and it was weighing over 100 pounds. This was going to take at least an hour to get back up there to the injured girl. We were up about halfway when the chopper confirmed a visual on the victim and confirmed that they would be able to do a lift out. So we dropped the stretcher but continued with supplies and got up to the girl with just the medical stuff. The chopper made visual contact with the crew when we got there. It hovered about 100 and 200 feet above us, and 2 medical people rappelled down from the chopper. They used scissors to carefully cut her out of her clothing to inspect for other broken bones, and they packed her up on a stretcher and then winched her out upwards. They said a previous hiker had found the dead body at about 10 a.m., but they didn't find any other injured hikers in their search, so they assumed that he had hiked alone. All said and done, we hiked back down with the fire department and we gave our testimony to the police. They told us the girl would have died had we not found her. The Woman on the Trail, submitted by Badass Bambi. In my old town I lived in Ohio, there's a set of hiking trails that wind through the hills on the edge of town. A lot of people walk, run, and bike there, and I've honestly never been out there without seeing at least 2 other people somewhere on the trails. This story is from my perspective as a female in my late 20s. Let me try to explain this place. There's a trail that's kind of shaped like a pushed-in oval that's about an 8-mile loop, with a number of intersecting trails that crisscross through the middle and lengthwise. It's very wooded, and unless you're right on top of an intersection, you can barely see other people on the other trails. About 2 years ago, I was out for a hike alone with just my iPod and my thoughts. It was a nice fall afternoon, and I had skipped out of work because it was so nice out, and I was trying to get some things together in my life. I was thinking about moving, and my boyfriend was not into that, and we were fighting a lot. While I was walking along with my Lecky poles, I saw 2 other people coming towards an intersection of the trails, and the one I needed to take back to my car. It was a man and a woman that looked like they were my age, and we did the whole, "Hey, how are you? Nice day for a hike" thing. They were also going back to the trailhead where the parking lot was, so we all just walked along. They were nice, but kind of chatty, and I was just wanting to be alone with my thoughts. But I didn't want to be rude, so we chatted along about nothing. Just how much we liked it out here and how often we came out to do the trails. We got back to our cars and politely said goodbye and said maybe we'd bump into each other again before the snow flew. Awesome, I thought. Maybe you can talk all the way through the hike again. I got in my Wrangler and saw them get into a gray Ford Escape and drive away while I was looking at my cell phone. I didn't answer anything on the hike, and my boyfriend had texted me a few times. I called him back, and we got into another fight, and I just hung up on him. A couple days later on Saturday, I went for another solo hike, and when I pulled into the trailhead parking lot, I saw the same Ford Escape and knew the chatty Cathys were out there somewhere. I grab my iPod and get going. I see them coming back on my way out, and we say hi and stop to chat for a second. Me, always the polite lady. I take off and enjoy the morning quiet and solitude, though. There were a bunch of people hiking on my way back out, and I was so glad that I went out so early. The next week was just work, the gym, fighting with my boyfriend, and me seriously considering a job offer out of state. The following weekend, I decided I was going and told my boyfriend that I had to do this and we could at least try a long-distance relationship for a bit, and maybe it would help us to have some space. He got pissed, and he told me I could have all the fucking space I wanted and stormed out of my apartment. I cried, but knew deep down it was probably the right thing to do. I got in my Jeep and headed out to the place I knew gave me solace. Hiking made me feel better, and when I got there I noticed that no one was there again. About halfway through, I see the woman from the pair of hikers walking along with no sign of the guy. We meet up and stop to chat, and I start my way back, and she stays with me, not saying much on the way back to the parking lot. When we got there, I took one look at my Wrangler and just said, "Fuck," out loud. 3 of my tires were flatter than pancakes. I know how to change tires, but that wasn't going to help me in this case. I sighed and called my dad, who doesn't answer the phone. In fact, everyone I called didn't answer the phone, so I bit the bullet and called my boyfriend. He was less than cordial, and before I could even tell him what was going on, he simply said, "Go enjoy your space," and hung up. The woman was standing there watching all this happen, and she offered to take me to get some help or take me home, and I'm realizing I'm stuck, so I have to accept. We get into her escape, and I put on my seatbelt, and then just burst into tears and turned my head to look away from this woman, whose name I'll say is simply E. E tries to comfort me and tells me everything is going to be okay, and that she'll get me home. I calm down and look back at her and say thanks, and give her an address of a street over from mine. I'm not that crazy to give a stranger my address, although she is being really nice to me. We get going, and she's trying to make small talk, and I'm a pretty lousy talker at this point. She says her place is on the way back to mine, and she needs to stop there for her bank card as she's almost out of gas. I don't really care at this point, but I should have. She drives to this house that's still outside of town with a long driveway off of the main road. Once we're there, she goes around the back and is in there for what I consider to be quite a long time. I'm still trying to call people, and no one is picking up or answering texts, and that's when I look down at the driver's side door storage shelf. There's a huge kitchen knife sitting in there, and I start to freak. There's no reason anyone needs something like that hanging loose in a vehicle. I'm not panicking yet, but I am scared and I want out of this car. I go to undo my seatbelt, but it's stuck or something. I'm yanking on it and getting more scared, and it's still not budging. I look at the clasp and see that there's this red box-like thing on it. It was a lock. What the hell was going on here? I desperately started looking for a key that would unlock it, but I'm sure the fear was confusing me. I'm sure everyone knows that feeling when you can't focus because you're so scared. I looked up, and here comes E towards the vehicle, carrying something. She looks at me with a blank expression and sets this set of thick wire stuff down, and then turns back to the house. I am now full-blown terrified when I notice it's pieces of a dog crate. Maybe she was just going to put that in the back of the Escape for a normal reason, but maybe not. I am literally screaming and pulling on this seatbelt, forgetting all about my phone, and she comes back around the house with a pile of blankets and the same blank stare. I look down at the console and see a little piece of metal that I realize is a key, and I grab it and try to use it on the lock. It worked, and I screamed again. I threw open the door and started running down the driveway back to the road. I got to it and ran across the road and into the forest for a bit and hid behind some trees and looked back. I saw the Escape come out the driveway and then head towards town. I called my boyfriend again, and this time he listened through my crying and sobbing and told me that he would come get me, but I had to tell him where I was. I creeped back to the edge of the road and saw an address number on the mailbox for the house, and he told me to get back in the woods and hide until he got there. Then he told me to call the police, which I did. I told them what was going on with my Wrangler and that my boyfriend was coming, but I was still scared. They said they would send someone out, but to stay on the line. The police got there before my boyfriend, and I burst into tears again and tried to tell him what had happened. He got me to settle down, and my boyfriend pulled up and I ran over to him. I had to make a full report with the officer, and I told him everything. He drove up to the house and came back and said no one was home, but he would be back to check. He got all of my information, and my boyfriend took me back to his place, saying we'd worry about my Jeep later. I stayed with him that night, terrified to go anywhere near my place, and the police called my cell and asked me to come to the station. My boyfriend took me down there, and the police told us that the owner of the house was an older woman who had been out shopping and that no younger woman lived there, but that she did have a woman matching my description that cleaned her house once per month, and that she did have a gray car. The lady gave her name, but said she always just paid her in cash and had responded to an ad in the newspaper for a cleaning service. She also mentioned that she was missing one dog crate. Anyway, I was okay and never saw E or that man again. The police followed up with me a month later and also let me know that woman never showed up at the house to clean it again. Looking back, maybe I made more of the situation than what it was. But then again, all of the stuff that happened has got me believing that E had something bad in store for me, and that I really came close to being kidnapped that day. Oh, and the police also thought all of it was on purpose, as someone had cut the valve stems on my Wrangler and not just let the air out. I moved from that area, and my boyfriend came with me after all, and we're still together. I still hike, but always carry pepper spray and constantly look over my shoulder. My man tries to go with me every chance he can, but that's not always the case. I know I probably won't, but I hope I never see E or that man again. Thanks for listening, gang. Check out my social media channels, and if you'd like to leave a tip for what you've heard, links to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and my Patreon page are all in the description below. And please like, share, comment, and subscribe if you care to, and let me know in the comments if you'd be down for a live stream over the weekend. A little Q&A maybe, and just some random nonsense from me. I've never done it before, I'd like to, so let me know. Also, don't forget to send your scary stories to Uncle Josh, truescarystories@gmail.com at any time. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.